In its battle with Ukraine, Russia has run up against an almost impenetrable wall in the form of the West. The entire NATO alliance of Western nations has been steadily ramping up its national and international defensive efforts. Even the alliance's most recent addition, Finland, gave access of over a dozen military bases on its soil to US troops. This gives the US and possibly the rest of NATO unimpeded access to bases that would be only miles away from Russian territory. But while Russia is trying to build the new Iron Curtain, something equally important is also brewing in the other direction, in the Far East, specifically Japan. Japan has tried to maintain neutrality ever since its disastrous involvement in World War II and the subsequent American occupation. But in the ever-changing geopolitical landscape, the country has slowly reformed its foreign policies. The culmination of these changes comes with the arrival of the new Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba and his ambitious plans for the country's future. Ostensibly, Japan isn't blind to the emerging New World Order, in which Russia has allied itself with China and is attempting to go against US influence practically all on its own. Considering that Russia is unlikely to get what it wants from NATO and the West, it might decide to settle for the next best thing, expanding its influence in the East. Which is precisely what Japan is trying to prevent by suggesting the formation of an Eastern version of NATO. By doing so, Japan would deliver a major blow to Russia's plans. Let's find out how. You see, Ishiba believes that the Indo-Pacific is one of the most vulnerable and volatile areas in current geopolitics. It has some of the world's largest economies and most populous countries: China, Japan, South Korea, India, Russia, the Philippines, Australia, and Singapore. But virtually none of those countries have ratified defense agreements in place with other large economies, apart from possibly China and Russia. This is a concern to Ishiba, who argues that the absence of a collective self-defense system such as NATO means that countries are more likely to act in their self-interest than work together to create military blocs. And there's some merit to the claim. China has been slowly ramping up its military and increasing the boldness of its military exercises. In mid-October, the country's navy deployed an aircraft carrier, warplanes, and other vessels as close to the coast of Taiwan as possible, in a clear exercise to seal off and blockade Taiwanese ports in a simulated China-Taiwan conflict. The fact that Taiwan is a geopolitical irregularity and is only partially recognized by UN nations and partially militarily supported by the US further complicates the matters in the region. In fact, the US doesn't have an official defense treaty with Taiwan, meaning that its presence in the area is not an indication that the country would actually help Taiwan in the event of a possible escalation of conflict. Ishiba's answer: an Eastern variant of NATO. The Japanese Prime Minister's idea for remedying the issues in the Indo-Pacific is twofold. First, he wants to make the aforementioned NATO analog in the Pacific, with countries such as South Korea, Australia, Singapore, and the Philippines all joining a meaningful defense assurance alliance, perhaps led by the US itself. Secondly, Japan wants to start expanding its military presence to reach beyond its own borders, through the use of US military bases in the Pacific, such as the one in Guam, a US territory in the Pacific. The first solution partially leads into the second and has been immediately flagged by both the US and Russia as problematic, and for a few good reasons. At its core, the idea is relatively simple. It emulates NATO's basic goals of uniting various nations, this time in the Indo-Pacific, against external threats, while also creating a level of internal consistency between them in terms of foreign policy. However, Ishiba doesn't have any concrete plans on which countries will be the most likely candidates to become members of the proposed Asian NATO. Australia and India are already in an informal alliance with the US and Japan, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, which focuses on broad strategic, economic, and humanitarian interests. When the Quad was first created in 2007, Japan's then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe envisioned it as a multinational network of allies. But in 2008, Australia's fears over Chinese economic retaliation against the Quad members caused the alliance to disperse. However, the Quad was reinstated in 2017 with the same members and pretty much the same goal as before. While the Quad is not a formal military alliance, Japan might seek to use the bilateral dialogues that it enables to urge members to make it an official defensive pact. Japan is also likely interested in using the Quad as a stepping stone, first accepting new members such as South Korea and Singapore, both of which are formidable economies and militaries on their own, before converting it into something more along the lines of NATO. The reason for this is simple. Japan hopes that by creating more military pacts in Asia, it can curb China and Russia's influence in the region. To that end, both nations have begun flexing their muscles in the region. China and Russia have started conducting increasingly elaborate joint military exercises in the area. In September, Russian aircraft breached Japan's territorial waters and airspace, which prompted the Japan Air Self-Defense Force (JASDF) to rally its fleet of F-35s and F-15s and launch flares in a warning. This was the first time the JASDF directly issued a warning to another nation's troops, and it was immediately followed by Japan protesting Russia's movements and actions through diplomatic channels. This may have been the catalyst for Japan trying to curb future infractions by officially aligning itself with other Indo-Pacific nations. However, the process through which Japan might be planning to do that is likely to be slow, if it gets officially enacted at all. Any sudden moves by Japan, such as recruiting multiple nations under a single defensive alliance, could prompt China and Russia to enact more aggressive measures. Essentially, the Russia-China alliance and Japan courting allies has ushered in a sort of stalemate over the area. Japan's worries are further exacerbated by the fact that the country is in close proximity to two countries with nuclear arsenals. After World War II, which showcased the power of nuclear weaponry and put Japan under US occupation as a result, the Japanese introduced the three non-nuclear principles in 1967. The principles prohibited Japan from possessing, manufacturing, and introducing nuclear weapons into its military capabilities. The non-nuclear principles were followed by the 4 pillars of nuclear policy a year later, which committed Japan to using nuclear energy peacefully and allowed the country to enjoy the US's extended nuclear deterrence policies. This meant that the US was the one responsible for counter-striking nuclear weapons that would be aimed at Japan. The initial treaties were reaffirmed with the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1976 and the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the 1990s, which restricted Japan from having the means to develop and deploy nuclear weapons. In fact, despite the US having more military bases and troops on Japanese soil than anywhere else in the world, apart from the US itself, Japan has never hosted US nuclear weapons. A proposal in 2017 to do so was summarily dismissed by the government at the time. But the most recent Japanese administrations have grown somewhat wary of this approach, and for 2 reasons. First, North Korea started independent nuclear testing in 2006, which directly contradicted worldwide bans on nuclear testing. Furthermore, North Korea has frequently tested its ballistic missile capacities by firing them over the Japanese archipelago into the Pacific Ocean. The ballistic testing only accelerated in recent years, as the world started paying more attention to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine rather than North Korea's missile tests. The tests in late 2022 showcased that North Korea already possessed the capability to target Guam with ballistic missiles, at least in theory. Given the relative proximity of North Korea and Japan, this also meant that Japan could be considered a potential target for North Korean aggression in the future. The second reason is, of course, Russia. More precisely, Russia opted out of nuclear testing bans in late 2023 after refusing to participate in the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, initiative with the US for tracking nuclear arsenal inspections. Russia justified its actions by following the example set by the US and bringing itself in line with US policies at the time. However, take note of the date of the opt-out. When the war in Ukraine started, Russia used its relatively vague nuclear deterrence policy to dissuade NATO from helping Ukraine. For the first 2.5 years of the war, the nuclear saber-rattling even worked, at least to an extent. The Kremlin reacted to any announcement of donations by pointing to its nuclear defense policy and implying that NATO's actions were a direct threat to the country and would ostensibly justify a nuclear response. This resulted in vital modern military equipment and weapons donations from NATO occasionally being delayed for months. But in 2024, NATO started crossing more and more of Russia's red lines and ignoring the threats. Of course, none of the threats ended up being realized, as Ukraine managed to hold onto its territory for far longer than analysts believed possible. Yet Putin has been adamant about maintaining the same levels of threats. Then in November, Russia announced yet another change to its nuclear doctrine, this time proposing that conventional aid from a country that had nuclear arsenals could result in a nuclear response. Additionally, China amassed a respectable arsenal of 500 nuclear warheads by 2023, putting it essentially in 3rd place behind the US and Russia in terms of overall numbers of weapons. And China has remained one of Russia's biggest allies, practically propping up the latter's economy after the invasion started. With all of these factors considered, it's easy to see why Japan is in a precarious situation. NATO has a much more robust deterrence policy against nuclear weapons, and the combined military defenses that the alliance has in Europe give it significant protection against Russia. Plus, Russia's main population centers are precariously close to its European neighbors. Even in the event Russia does launch nuclear weapons, it will be swiftly counterattacked by the US and Europe and would also face fallout from its own arsenal. Japan doesn't have those kind of protections, at least geographically, As an island with no widespread military defense treaties, Japan will be a relatively easy target should Russia launch nuclear weapons from its submarine base in Kamchatka into Japanese territory. It's that type of threat that Japan hopes to cut off at the knees. With that in mind, Ishiba's statements about creating a new NATO analog in the Indo-Pacific would also directly imply a new form of widespread nuclear deterrence and detection policies. It could also mean a turnabout from Japan's restrictive nuclear weapons policies. For now though, Japanese policies remain in place, but its aspirations of getting a new nuclear defense umbrella could be met with its alliance proposals with South Korea. In 2023, the US and South Korean governments announced that South Korea would get access to a nuclear-armed submarine. This came as a result of the neighboring North Korea expanding its repertoire of ballistic missile and nuclear arms testing, as we mentioned earlier. However, unlike Japan, South Korea has far more public and political support for obtaining nuclear weapons. The 2023 deal with the US is therefore likely to only be the start, with the possibility that the country might get more weapons from the US or launch an independent weapons program. With the Japanese aspirations of maintaining alliances with other Indo-Pacific nations that are also allied with the US, South Korea seems like a natural choice to join in a defensive pact. Both countries are practically neighbors with China and Russia and have been under direct threats from North Korean weapon testing before. And there's yet another aspect of why Japan needs to maintain a stronger alliance: economics. The Indo-Pacific area accounts for roughly 60% of international trade, specifically passing through the waters of China and Japan. Japan was one of the first nations to realize the rapid proliferation of the Chinese economy at the start of the 2000s, far quicker than its Western allies did. By 2013, it became apparent that China was pushing to become a major geopolitical player through its economic and industrial capacities. To that end, China has pushed to extend its influence in the region, particularly through its territorial claims in the South and East China Seas. The Chinese claims in the area directly overlap with practically every other nation in the region. The exclusive economic zones in the East China Sea, consisting of South Korea, Japan, and China, clash in more ways than one. This is because the sea, which is only 360 nautical miles wide, doesn't have the width necessary to accommodate every zone extending for 200 nautical miles. Additionally, China claims that it has the right to an extended economic zone as part of its continental shelf, putting its zone deeper into Japanese waters. This has been exacerbated by the fact that a significant natural gas deposit was found in the middle of the East China Sea, covering the area where the economic zones overlap. China has been found to have drilled into the well, at least on its side of the natural gas deposit, despite Japan's urging not to exploit the field before the economic zone dispute was settled. But perhaps even more important than the economic zones is the fact that China has funded economic and infrastructure programs throughout the Indo-Pacific and even beyond. One of the most notable such programs is the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to create a series of overland and marine trade routes between China and various developing countries. Ultimately, the goal of the Belt and Road Initiative is for China to create a more favorable trade route through which it can access the oil exported by the Middle East. Particularly, a land route that connects China to Pakistan would allow the oil link to bypass the Indo-Pacific sea routes entirely, using only a part of the Persian Gulf for overseas travel. To accomplish that, China has invested millions of dollars into countries in the Indo-Pacific. This has imbalanced the existing agreements that were spearheaded by developed countries in the region, particularly Japan, South Korea, and Australia. China's Belt and Road Initiative can be seen as yet another attempt by the country to counter the US influence in the region, and it's one that seems to have started to bear fruit. According to Ishiba, the lowered US influence and involvement in the region, particularly during the administration of outgoing President Joe Biden, has been one of the major reasons why he proposed his NATO-like plans in the first place. The Japanese administration believes that if China is allowed to remain unchecked, it might spiral its economic influence over its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific into a militaristic one. Even then, there's another major catch in Japan's plans to create a mutual defense alliance in the region: India. India is arguably the second largest and most important economy in the region, after China. However, India and China have a long history of territorial disputes and geopolitical opposition. Somewhat paradoxically, though, both countries are members of BRICS, an economic alliance that includes Russia. India and China have replaced Europe as the biggest importers of Russian oil and gas, for example, and India has been working on building additional economic ties with Russia. And yet, as we mentioned, India and Japan, alongside Australia and the US, are members of the Quad. The Quad is perhaps one of the most natural starting points of a NATO-like alliance in Asia, with all 4 members being countries with large economies. But it's also a non-military alliance. That's important to note since all the countries have disputes with China and have aspirations of international military exercises between them. This has angered China several times over. This puts the prospect of India becoming one of the key members of the alliance in dispute. If Japan aims to make a new military defense pact that would stifle China's and, by extension, Russia's military influence against it and its close allies, India would likely be a natural member, considering that it's had issues with China in the past. However, the fact that India is also among the few countries that have deep economic ties with Russia goes directly against Japan's prime directive for the alliance in the first place. Furthermore, India's relations with the US have generally remained positive, with the two countries signing various deals for military equipment and investment in the region. And yet the diverging views over Russia could put those relations at an impasse. Without India in the alliance, the other countries in the region like South Korea and Australia would lose a significant economic and military partner. Unsurprisingly, Russia's actions in the war in Ukraine have also had a polarizing effect on the entire region, specifically regarding its relations with India. Despite using Russian oil and gas, India doesn't wholly support Russian aggression and plans, especially its attempts at building a new economic and militaristic bloc in the region with China and North Korea. This web of geopolitical connections that seemingly has India at the center could unravel Japan's plans of trying to create an alliance. But with Trump now in the White House, India might not even be as big of a concern. While there was trepidation as to how Trump would guide the US foreign policy, the two leaders have already got off to a good start in building a prosperous and mutually beneficial relationship. Trump and Ishiba have stated that the countries will be working together to improve security in the region as they pursue a new golden age of US-Japan relations. Ishiba also unveiled plans to purchase US-made liquefied natural gas and expand investment in the world's largest economy to $1 trillion. This comes amidst Trump announcing severe tariffs on goods imported from Canada, China, and Mexico. With Japan avoiding the first wave of tariffs, there's hope that the trend continues and that Japan-US trade will blossom. But there's still no telling what the US might do, especially with the war in Ukraine raging on. Trump had already noted that he has some big plans on how to approach peace deals and has already rebuffed Putin by announcing that the war should already be over. Regardless, Ishiba will need to carefully gauge how willing the new US administration is to foster deeper economic ties with both Europe and the Indo-Pacific if he wants the Asian version of NATO to have a fighting chance on the global geopolitical stage. But what do you think? Will Japan overturn its pacifistic tendencies? Would an Indo-Pacific version of NATO be an efficient deterrent? Thanks for watching and leave your comments below. Now go and check out Japan Just Dealt Russia a Devastating Blow, or click this other video instead.